In this lesson, we'll be drawing the perspective buildup that will be used for the final line art. Before we get started with the buildup, this is the point where we move from doing preliminary sketches and focusing primarily on the design process to actually executing some of the ideas that we have. This means that it's good before you start to do this lesson to do a quick review of the work you've done so far and ask yourself whether you are satisfied with the outcome. If you are dissatisfied with the way your sketches came out, or there are still things that you feel you haven't really been able to resolve, it is a good idea to do some extra small sketches now before you start this to resolve these issues. This will allow you to more confidently step in this stage of the process. Another thing I want to point out before we start is that I would recommend using pretty much the same pose you've used for the function breakdown, just to make your life easier. However, you can, if you want, try to use a different pose for this. If you do want to use a different pose, I would recommend, similar to how we did all the other parts of this design process, to just do some quick sketches to get confident with this pose before you use it. We've already gone through quite a lot of different techniques on how to do build-up as we went through this course. A lot of these will be repeated here, so I will just point out the new ones that I use and make a special point here to point out that the biggest difference with the previous build-ups and this one is that we are a little bit more focused on accuracy this time. In our previous build-ups, we were more focused on just exploring ideas and testing proportions. But in this one, we want to be a little bit more accurate since this will be used as our main guideline to draw a highly refined line art over it. The first thing I do in this build-up is to establish the base perspective using the similar bounding box technique that I mentioned in the first lesson. In this one, I expand a little bit on it and also define a center line, which will help me make sure that my drawing is symmetrical as I keep going. Then, I use this center line and the relative position of where the middle is to use something that you could reference as an extrusion technique, which is essentially drawing the 2D plane of the shape, focusing on the general shape and proportion of it, which I can then use as a marker to extrude in 3 dimensions, meaning I use all the relative points that I've created and then extrude those into a 3D shape. I use this general position of the middle to then measure relative proportions. In general, the approach I have to perspective buildings, especially as they get more complicated, is that I prefer to use a relative approach, which means that I almost entirely build it up by measuring objects against each other, looking at the relative sizes they should have, and then building that out from a point. Some people like to identify the top and bottom of the drawing and then constantly reference this by essentially seeing what the relation and proportion is of a shape within the overall dimensions of the drawing. I prefer to build it up from a point, meaning that I keep attaching objects to each other and focus on whether or not they sit in space correctly with each other. This approach has its benefits, but its downsides. One of its benefits is that it is easier to just focus on the relative proportions, which will allow you to make sure that they actually sit in space well, and that proportions look the way that you wanted when you started drawing. Since sometimes things can end up looking a bit distorted, or you feel like you don't really have the space you feel you should for some of the shapes if you use the other technique. The downside, however, is that you don't necessarily have full control over where the drawing ends up on your page sometimes. Sometimes it can grow far larger than you expected because the legs were in fact longer than you thought they were going to be, or the body ends up higher than you expected. But for me, this technique creates the best results. When I've drawn a part using this relative approach, I then use the center line that I started with in my perspective buildup to mirror it to the other side. While doing this, I constantly draw extra guidelines to keep measuring roughly where points should end up. For example, I use things like the endpoint of a foot to then draw a guideline from there in perspective to see on what line the point should end up. Then I look at the distance from the center line based on my relative perspective buildup that I did on the part to then see where that line should start in space. I can then cross-reference many of these lines with the overall place that the leg should be based on my buildup to keep measuring whether or not it is falling correctly in perspective. Throughout this process, you're trying to get accurate proportions based on all your preliminaries. However, it is good to keep in mind that it is expected to readjust a lot as you do this. This is the stage where you want to make sure you've kind of corrected everything and got things at a good place so that you can confidently draw over it. This means that it's okay to make the build-up slightly messier but more accurate proportionally, or fix more issues, since in the final lineup it'll be a lot harder to fix those same issues. Near the end of the build-up, I use another technique for drawing the arm. I wanted to have it at a slight angle, which means that the perspective will actually have a different vanishing point. To make my life easier on doing this build-up and not to overcomplicate it, the technique that I sometimes like to use is to draw it straight first by just drawing the center line of the object in the relative proportion, being the beginning and end point, and then rotate that line in 3D to create the center line. This will then allow me to understand exactly where each of the beginning and end points need to end up, and then I can use that as an easy guide to then draw a perspective in. I personally eyeball the differing vanishing points because I personally feel like it gets far too complicated to have to actually build up every single one of those lines in a drawing. It is good as an exercise, but for an actual practical drawing, it can sometimes get just too chaotic and is far more steps than you really practically need to get a good end result. For actually drawing the buildup of the arm, I use a similar approach as what I mentioned in the function breakdown lesson, where I had a fear that the lines would become very unreadable, since the arm would overlap an already very complicated part of the buildup, being the legs. So to avoid this, I used a somewhat thicker and darker pen to do the buildup for the arm, so that it stands out against the rest. This means that it will be easier for me to read which lines are meant for the arm and which lines are meant for the legs as I draw. The task for this lesson will be to draw the buildup for your chosen design, using the techniques that have been mentioned previously and that have been mentioned in this class. You should draw this buildup to the level of your own satisfaction, that this is enough information for you to do your final drawing over.